Maria stood at the church entrance, her white dress feeling more like a shroud than a symbol of joy. At 17, she should have been dreaming of university, of traveling, of discovering who she might become. Instead, she was about to marry Thomas Whitmore, a man 42 years her senior, a widower she had met exactly 3 times before this moment. Her father's gambling debts had sealed her fate. The Whitmore family owned half the county, and Thomas had offered a solution that her desperate parents couldn't refuse. The arrangement was clinical, transactional. She would become his wife, bring youth and companionship to his lonely estate, and in return, her family would be saved from ruin. As she walked down the aisle, Maria kept her eyes fixed on the stained glass windows rather than the man waiting at the altar. Thomas stood straight-backed, his gray hair neatly combed, his face weathered but not unkind. He was old enough to be her grandfather, and the thought made her stomach turn. When the priest asked if she took this man as her lawfully wedded husband, the word yes emerged as barely a whisper. The reception was a blur of faces she didn't know. Well-wishers who congratulated Thomas on his new bride while she stood silent beside him like an ornamental piece. When they finally left for Whitmore Manor, Maria sat as far from him as possible in the car, watching the countryside roll past, each mile taking her further from the life she'd known. The manor was magnificent and intimidating, with its gray stone walls and ivy-covered turrets. Thomas showed her inside without attempting to touch her, his hands clasped behind his back as he gave her a tour of what was now supposedly her home. The halls were filled with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, all looking stern and judgmental. When they reached the master bedroom, Maria's heart began to race with dread. This was the moment she had been fearing, the inevitable consummation that would make this nightmare fully real. But Thomas simply pointed to an adjoining door. "That's your room," he said quietly. "I had it prepared for you. I thought you might prefer your own space." Maria stared at him, confused. "My room? Yes." "I realize this situation is not what either of us would have chosen freely. I don't expect you to. That is, I won't demand anything from you that you're not willing to give." His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I simply hoped for companionship in my later years. Perhaps someone to share meals with, to walk the gardens with. Nothing more." She felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from relief or the sheer strangeness of it all, she couldn't say. That night, she locked herself in her room and cried until dawn, mourning the future that had been stolen from her, even as a small part of her acknowledged that things could have been far worse. The next morning, Maria woke to find a breakfast tray outside her door with a handwritten note. "Please take your time settling in. There's no rush to do anything. The library is on the 2nd floor if you enjoy reading. Thomas." The days began to establish a pattern. Thomas would knock gently on her door each morning and ask if she'd like to join him for breakfast. At first, she refused, staying locked in her room, eating alone. But loneliness eventually drove her out, and she found herself sitting across from him at the long dining table, picking at her food while he read the newspaper. He didn't force conversation. Sometimes they would eat in complete silence, but it wasn't the oppressive silence she'd expected. It was almost comfortable. When he did speak, it was to ask simple questions about whether she needed anything, if her room was satisfactory, if she'd like the cook to prepare something specific. One morning, 3 weeks into their marriage, Maria ventured a question of her own. "Why did you agree to this arrangement? You could have found someone more willing." Thomas set down his coffee cup and regarded her thoughtfully. "My first wife, Eleanor, died 5 years ago. We were married for 30 years, and I loved her deeply. This house has felt empty ever since. Your father approached me with his proposition, and I saw an opportunity for both of us. I know you don't want to be here, Maria. I'm not blind to that, but I hope that perhaps, in time, this could become a safe place for you. A place where you could pursue your interests, continue your education if you wished, and simply exist without fear or pressure." His honesty surprised her. "You don't want a real wife, then?" "I want a companion. A friend, perhaps, if that's possible. I'm too old to start over romantically, and I have no interest in forcing myself on someone who doesn't want me. That's not the kind of man I am." something in Maria began to shift. She started joining him for meals regularly, and their conversations grew longer. She learned that Thomas was an avid reader, that he'd traveled extensively in his youth, that he painted watercolors as a hobby. He learned that she'd dreamed of becoming a teacher, that she loved mathematics and poetry in equal measure, that she'd never been allowed to have a pet growing up. One afternoon, Thomas appeared at her door with a basket. Inside was a small gray kitten with enormous green eyes. "I thought you might like some company," he said, looking almost shy. Maria named the kitten Athena, and for the first time since arriving at the manor, she smiled genuinely. Thomas seemed to take note of this, and over the following weeks, small gifts began appearing. Not jewelry or expensive things, but books he thought she'd enjoy, art supplies, a comfortable reading chair positioned by the best window in the library. He hired a tutor for her, a kind woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who came 3 times a week to continue Maria's education. When Maria expressed interest in the manor's overgrown garden, Thomas arranged for a gardener to teach her about plants and landscaping. He asked nothing in return for any of this. He simply wanted her to be less miserable. 6 months into their marriage, Maria realized something unsettling. She no longer felt like a prisoner. The manor had become a sanctuary, a place where she could read, learn, and grow without the constant criticism she'd endured at home. Thomas had become not a jailer, but an unlikely guardian, someone who asked for nothing but her presence at meals and occasional walks through the estate. One evening, as they sat in the library together, each reading by the firelight, Maria looked up from her book and studied him. He was old, yes, with deep lines around his eyes and age spots on his hands. But there was a gentleness to him, a fundamental decency that she'd never expected to find. "Thomas," she said softly. He looked up from his own book. "Yes. Thank you. For being kind to me. For giving me space and time. For not being the monster I expected." His expression softened. "You're welcome, my dear. Though I'm sorry you expected a monster at all. That speaks poorly of the circumstances that brought you here." As another year passed, their relationship deepened into genuine friendship. Maria found herself seeking out his company, enjoying their conversations about books and philosophy, laughing at his dry wit. He encouraged her studies and celebrated her achievements. When she expressed interest in auditing classes at the nearby university, he arranged it immediately. She was 19 when she realized she cared for him, not romantically perhaps, but with real affection. He had given her freedom within the constraints of their situation, had respected her boundaries, had become her advocate and supporter. When he fell ill with pneumonia that winter, she sat by his bedside for 3 days, reading to him, making sure he took his medicine, terrified that he might die. When he recovered, he took her hand weakly and said, "Thank you for caring for an old man." "You're not just an old man," she replied. "You're my friend, perhaps the best friend I've ever had." His eyes grew misty. "That means more to me than you know." Maria came to understand that love could take many forms. What she felt for Thomas wasn't passion or romance, but it was real nonetheless. It was gratitude and affection, respect and companionship. He had given her a life she couldn't have imagined, had protected her from the fate that befell so many women forced into such arrangements. On their 2nd anniversary, she moved some of her things into his room, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to be near him. They still maintained their own spaces, but now they fell asleep talking to each other, sharing their thoughts about the day, making plans for tomorrow. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep when Maria was 23. She mourned him deeply, genuinely, holding his hand as the doctor confirmed what she already knew. He had left everything to her, the manor, the estate, and more importantly, the freedom to choose her own path forward. At his funeral, Maria spoke honestly about the man who had been forced upon her as a husband, but had chosen to be something better. He had shown her that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness could flourish. That trapped situations could transform. That an unwanted marriage could become an unexpected sanctuary. Years later, Maria would turn the manor into a school for girls, especially those from difficult circumstances. She would teach them mathematics and literature, show them the gardens she'd created, and tell them about the unexpected kindness of an old man who had changed her life. She would make sure they knew that they deserved respect, autonomy, and gentleness, just as Thomas had shown her. His portrait hung in the school's entrance hall, and sometimes Maria would pause before it, remembering the man who could have been a monster but chose instead to be kind. She would think about how forced beginnings could lead to genuine bonds, how the worst situation of her young life had somehow become the foundation for everything good that followed. The marriage she'd been forced into had indeed changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. It had taught her about the transformative power of respect, patience, and unexpected kindness, lessons she would spend the rest of her life passing on to others who needed to hear them.